Welcome to Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. Always a treat to be with you. Today, I have two phenomenal guests, Brandi Wilson and Youre Wilhite. I knew I wanted to talk to both of them because we continue to be in a season where church leaders are being discovered with secret sins or abuse, some kind of a significant cover-up. I'm talking mostly church leaders that are famous enough to make the news. It's just a real tragedy that there seems to be almost no end to these stories. And I'm always interested in what's going on around these stories. Obviously, the leader gets heavily featured. Unfortunately, most commonly, the leader tends to move into denial or minimization, or worse yet, cover up and re-victimization of the brave people that come forward. It's become almost a cliche. I'm sure we're all pretty sick of it. But do we ever think about the spouse of that leader, the friend of the spouse? Like, for example, the pastor's wife, who poured in every bit as much as the preacher did who got caught. But because of the husband's sin, the preacher's sin, her life is now radically upended. That's Brandi Wilson's story in 2016, where her husband, first of all, resigned and then very quickly was discovered to be having a secret life. And suddenly, Brandi found herself no longer at the church she had helped plant, no longer married, now a single mom, having to figure out how to make money to raise her kids. And I also wanted to interview Brandi's best friend, Youre Wilhite. I've had the pleasure of knowing Youre and her husband, Judd, for almost 20 years now. They're the lead pastors at Central Christian Church, where I used to work in Las Vegas. And Youre and Judd are amazing people. Youre and Brandi created this incredible movement called Leading and Loving It for women in leadership. It really started out for pastors' wives. Now it's for any women finding themselves in a leadership role. And so I thought, how amazing would it be to talk to Brandi and Youre together? Brandi, who got the brunt of the problems, and Youre, who, even from a couple of thousand miles away, wanting to be a good friend to Brandi. What was it like for them when Brandi's world fell apart? Now, this is obviously sensitive material, and we get right into it in the podcast. And so this is as good a time as any just to pause and relax into God's presence. When life pulls the rug out from under you, it can be so hard. Like sometimes it's easier to notice God when life pulls the rug out from under you because you're free falling and you're desperate. But sometimes you're so busy grappling and so exhausted, it's harder to notice God's presence. So today, particularly for those of you that feel like you're free falling, feel like the rug has been pulled out from under you, just a moment to light a candle. Remember that God is with us. Surely the Lord was in this place, and I was not aware of it. And also, not just God being with us, but is there something in your life right now where it helps you to remember that God is also ahead of you? God is already at work. Let me do that again. God is already at work in that place or that person about which you're anxious. Okay, here's Brandi and Youre. Brandi Wilson, Youre Wilhite, you guys are the founders of Leading and Loving It. Let's start there. What is it?
Well, Leading and Loving It is really just a ministry that comes alongside women leaders and tries to help them lead strong and thrive in ministry. And you know what, Steve, actually love it because let's be honest, there's some times where we don't like it very much, or sometimes, if we're honest, where we really loathe it. But the goal is that we can actually love what God has called us to do. And so that's our hope, is just to come alongside a bunch of women and encourage them and keep them going.
And Youre, I was at Central when you and Judd first came and unpacked those boxes. My memory of it was we had a number of candidates come and take turns speaking on the stage. And Judd was the first candidate where I was sitting there thinking, man, this guy just looks like he's always been there, like he belongs. It felt like from your first day, you guys kind of came home. But I know what's also true. It was your first lead pastor role.
Right.
I'd love to hear that first year. What was that like for you as Judd was getting the hang of it and the impact on you as well?
Well, it's funny you say that, Steve, because when we were interviewing, I remember him going up on the stage and just everything in my spirit said, this is where we're supposed to be. Like watching, I'd seen him on a lot of stages and I had never had that moment of thinking like, this is it. This is where we're supposed to be. So we were excited. I was very pregnant with Ethan. My son, I had him 5 weeks after we moved to Vegas. And I remember we had just moved in and Judd said, I'm going to ask you not to unpack a lot of these boxes. We're going to put them in the garage because we may not survive this leadership transition. And I was like, that's fabulous. I'm so excited that we just moved across the desert and to a place where we may not survive it. So the first year was a year where we felt for sure like we were exactly where God wanted us. But it was also really hard because leadership transitions are really hard. And, by the grace of God and the kindness of a lot of people, we were able to kind of round that corner eventually. And now we've been here 21 years. And so we feel super blessed. But, it was definitely an interesting first couple of years, and as it is in any transition.
Yeah. Yeah, so you and Judd came into an established, very large church, several thousand people attending. Brandi, you had quite a different experience. You and Pete planted a church. Was that your
Yes.
first church plant?
No, we actually planted our first church in Kentucky, right outside of Bowling Green, about 6 months before we were married. And we were there for 5 years. And then in 2001, I was thinking, yes, 2001, moved to Nashville and ended up planting Crosspoint Church in 2002.
And then it became quite a rocket ship. It was one of those churches that just exploded. It got national exposure. Pete became quite nationally well known. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I loved being part of the church. I loved being the pastor's wife. I loved getting to be part of the staff community and did staff meeting with them every Tuesday and had those people in my home. And that was my relational circle as well as, my church family. I was young and I was growing our family at home. We had 3 young sons, and he was growing the church. And yeah, I actually loved everything about it. In fact, when Lori and I were working on leading and loving it stuff early on, I always came with a super optimistic viewpoint to whatever we were discussing at the time because I so loved everything that God had called us to do, that front row seat to life change, and getting to see the way your church community impacts the city that God has called you to.
Yeah. And then for those who aren't aware, 2016 happened. Would you mind just telling us what happened in 2016?
In 2016, my husband at the time chose to walk away from the church and the ministry and our marriage and our family. And my life fell apart. And it felt like it fell apart overnight. I know to people in the community and, just in the church world, it definitely felt like it had happened overnight. I think we are all aware that when your life publicly falls apart, it's been privately falling apart for a long time. But I found the life I knew it had ended. I was no longer, part of the church. I was no longer a pastor's wife. I was on my way to no longer being a wife. And I really had to figure out how I was going to start over again.
Yeah. And if I recall, you and Pete were somewhat like teenage sweethearts, got married young. It's always interesting if a couple get married young. Like, were you 21, Brandi, when you got married? Is that right?
I was 22. I had just turned 22. We were college sweethearts and had dated for 3.5 years before we were married. And then we were married for 20 years.
Yeah. Like you get married at 22, you are still growing up.
Oh, for sure.
And after a 20 plus year marriage, you find yourself that if nothing else, this man has borne witness to your life for 2 decades. And now you are navigating it without him. I'd like to get your reaction to that.
Yeah, it was terrifying. I really love being a wife. I love being a mom. I had never envisioned, raising a family as the only adult in the household. And then really just thought we would be at cross point until we retired. I loved the community that much. Nashville was home. I had in-laws here, have in-laws here, call them outlaws now that I'm divorced. They're no longer in-laws, they're outlaws, but love them dearly. So I really just thought this was what the future was going to be, and it was all turned upside down. So I think I experienced absolutely every emotion that you can experience. There's immense grief, there's fear, there's tons of anxiety. Depression came along with that. I was overwhelmed. I had more questions than answers. So there's just a lot of digging out of the rubble of life imploding, and trying to figure out what is my next best step.
Yeah. And Laurie, one of the reasons I was hoping you would join in this conversation is you and Brandi are dear friends, even though you live quite a ways apart. How did you find out about Pete?
Well, I remember Brandi called me. I was actually on a trip and my phone rang. And as soon as I picked it up, I just heard in her voice something is not right. So I stepped outside and sat down, and she just started crying and telling me, uh, that he had moved out and it was really bad. And I remember just sitting in a little bit of shock because in a lot of ways, mine and Brandy's lives have run very parallel. We were married 2 weeks apart, even though we didn't know each other. There are so many things that are very, very similar about our lives. And I love her so deeply and so dearly that um, it was a shock. And also I felt so far, being two time zones and what felt like, mostly a country apart felt insurmountable at times. Like I couldn't get to her. I couldn't hug her. I couldn't, let her cry on my shoulder. We're just on a phone, which thank God for. And also I felt the distance took a toll in the sense of I just felt like I could have done more if I had been there. So you feel like your hands are tied a little bit. But it was just heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking. That first conversation. And that was before things were public, and it was before he had resigned. It was before a lot of that. So then the gift of that conversation, as hard as I know it was for her to make that phone call and have to say those words, even to me, her best friend, it did give us the opportunity to then walk alongside each other through what were some really, really difficult times, really hard times.
Yeah. I think there's two dynamics I was hoping we could explore. One is, I think it's a shock when you sacrifice and give everything you have to give to the local church. And then at some point you realize because of your role, you have very little agency. Mm. So like Pete's decision, Brandi, you didn't have agency over how that shifted your life in relationship to the church. Mm-hmm. In a similar way, Laurie, my wife Lisa has experienced this. When I was leading, I would make decisions that she may not agree with, and yet wasn't really free in our church to say, you don't like it, you should hear what I think about, like it's not that she has to toe the party line, it just puts her in a bind. So maybe Brandi, for you first, this is the church that you'd poured out, you love, you had so many relationships. I think it would help people just to hear, what's it like when you don't have agency? Someone else makes a decision, you're the one that pays for it.
Yeah, it feels terribly unfair and very hurtful. I think, going back, hindsight is always 2020, and there is no handbook on how to exit a church in a scenario like I was in. I think lots of information came to the surface post resignation, and post divorce even. So having, known what I know now, I think it would have been handled differently then. But at that point, I was honestly, after the resignation, I was trying to keep my family and my marriage together. That became my focus. I was devastated and heartbroken by the loss of the church. And honestly, once I knew I was getting divorced, I had to do a ton of identity work on what it was like to no longer be married, to be a single mom, but also what is it like when you're no longer in ministry and that is all you've known? What is it like when you have been the lead pastor's wife of one of the fastest growing churches in America and actually love doing that? So I had to dig in and do a ton of identity work of, who is Brandi? What do I enjoy? What do I want life to look like? One of the best things Lori did for me in the process of just separation and resignation and divorce and post-divorce was continuing to remind me that, titles and roles can be taken from you, but no one can take God's call on your life but him. So she continued to remind me like, hey, you can stay in ministry. That's when I ended up going on staff officially with Leading and Loving It. Just because you're divorced, it doesn't sideline you and mean that God doesn't want to use you anymore. So that actually brought back a lot of ownership and identity that I was familiar with, but it built it up on the solid foundation of making sure that it was, my relationship with God that was guiding there and not riding the coattails of a successful church or a successful pastor.
We're seeing, we're in 2024 and we're seeing just what feels like a steady stream of public Christian leaders that are found to have a secret life that's destructive or a habit. As a general rule, there's always exceptions. Many of those leaders, when they're caught, they double down rather than take ownership. What I've noticed then is the public response then is to try to demonize them. Like we forget that they're human, that there are actual human beings involved in these situations. I'd love to get your take first, Lori, whether we're talking about what happened with Pete and Brandi or just in general. How are we, those of us who are not involved in the day-to-day, we're not personally impacted, but we're reading these stories, how are we to respond? Because I'm struggling. I see so much outrage that sometimes feels like self-righteousness to me. I'd love to get your take, Lori, on that.
Yeah, I think, if you rewind 10 years ago, probably my reaction when I read things was anger. I think now it's a lot of heartbreak. Having walked this with Brandi, I always think about the people who are on the backside of those kinds of failings, the people that we don't see in the news and we don't read about in the articles that are like their lives are completely turned over and devastated. So I definitely interact with those kinds of stories differently. It is really, really heartbreaking to see that happen. Like for Brandi, I felt like you talk about how Brandi didn't have a lot of agency kind of in that moment. But I think part of my role as her friend in that time was to show her that she did. like you actually do. And you've lost a lot and a lot has been taken from you that you would not have chosen to give. And also, we're not going to let any more ground be taken and we're not going to let anything else be handed over. And we're going to fight really hard to make sure that you are able to do everything God has called you to do. And I feel like that, so much of what I think Brandi has done, especially in the last probably 3 or 4 years, is take everything that has happened to her. She did a lot of work. And then she's been able to use that to help so many of the wives that are on the backside of these stories that you're talking about. I always tell people, if you've read a story about a pastor that's fallen in the news, it's likely Brandi has been talking to them, or helping them and coaching them and crying with them and all of the things. And, I wish Brandi had never had to go through what she went through, but I also know that God is using it in a really special way. as a gift to people. So, because there are a lot of people in ministry, as you know, Steve, leadership can be very lonely, and they just don't have a lot of people that they can talk to. And so most people, when they go through that, are completely isolated. Brandi was right on the precipice of that, even though she actually had people in her life that she could have very easily isolated, because you just have so few people that are kind of in the know of really, really what's going on in your life. And I think now what she's able to give people is the gift of companionship, of somebody who understands, who can walk through those situations with them, for people that really don't have people who can do that in their lives, which I think is a gift.
Yeah. Yeah. Just as I'm listening to both of you, the passage that keeps screaming in my mind is 2 Corinthians 1:3 and 4, the blessed be the God of all comfort that comforts us in our trials so we can comfort others with the comfort we have received. And so often in these situations, like Brandi, you have a ministry that, for example, I could never be helpful with because of the comfort and experience you've received. I am curious, Brandi, as you are now, you're 7 or 8 years past the intense beginning of this journey, as you are now helping people, what patterns are you seeing that's helpful in recovery?
Great question. I think patterns that are helpful in recovery is acknowledging the dysfunction and the health that you lived in and didn't realize at the time. You alluded to the fact that I was 22 when I got married and still growing up. And I think so often, we end up living in situations that are unhealthy because we don't know a difference. And we feel called to protect our husbands and also protect the church. I felt super strongly about protecting the church. That felt like such an honor to, that God had chosen to use us in such a way. I took that very seriously. So I think when it comes to getting healthy, it is acknowledging that I was in a situation where I did not function in a healthy environment or in a healthy relationship. I think it's also important to just be able to look at how much you trust yourself and the Holy Spirit's guidance in your life, and that, God-given intuition, that in lots of times scenarios like that, we're taught to not trust ourselves and to not validate, or not to even feel and express our emotions. Even emotions are controlled when you're in a relationship like that. So to be able to just lean in and start recognizing, this is what I feel, and recognizing that, expressing that, being able to articulate that is super helpful. And then trusting yourself in the midst of making those hard decisions. And, filing for divorce was not an easy decision to make. And I would say 99% of the women I work with, one of the questions that they ask is, have I made the wrong decision? Because you know that you are moving forward in a path that's going to irrevocably change your family and your life. So just trusting that, God continues to have his best for you. God has good in your life. He is good to you. And that is not going to stop just because life has imploded. You continue to lean into his goodness to get you through each day.
Yeah, and I guess there's also just very real financial security anxiety in those decisions too. It's like, oh man,
Yeah.
I now need to
Yeah.
figure out a whole path that I'd never planned on figuring out.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I know for me, life became easier once I got divorced in absolutely every other way except for finances. So, you go from, being part of something that's super successful and well paid, and then everything's divided. And I had not been in the workforce in a paid position in, since my youngest was 5. So it had been, and that was just part time. So I hadn't done full time work in 20 years when I got divorced. So yeah, financially, the ramifications. I right now have so many single moms that I'm talking to who are having to sell homes and relocate, move their family again because they can't afford the home they're in, and are really just, running really hard trying to make ends meet. And it's hard when you are the only financial provider in your home.
Yeah. Laurie, I run into so many people when I'm just chatting with them, and they'll say, "You worked at Central Christian Church?" I said, "Oh yeah, I was there for several years, and I was there when Gene Apple was the pastor. I was there in the interim, and then I was there when Judd and Laurie Wilhite." And so many of those people say, "Judd and Laurie Wilhite, I got to spend a day with them. Like, I went to Vegas and Judd gave us time. I brought a group, and like, you guys are constantly pouring into church leaders." I want to ask both of you, maybe Laurie, we could start with you. I want to ask both of you, these public figures that get exposed for this secret life, it's now out. The classic stereotype is they double down. Sometimes their board will come around and demonize the victim, things like that. It would be easy for us just to write these people off and say, or to say, well, they're all a bunch of narcissists. Is there another way? Is there a more nuanced way we can look at what's going on with these leaders that gives them some hope for their own redemption journey? I guess, Laurie, let me start with you.
Oh, Steve, I feel like, you know what? I feel complication in answering this because, yes, I'm sure okay. And also, having been at the front seat of watching an implosion like that happen, I also am like, yeah, I also feel that very deeply to my core. 'Cause the truth is, not everybody does get demonized. Not everybody does get sidelined. Some of them keep going. Some of them are still in ministry. Some of them are still leading. And that is equally not right and hard and really painful to watch. And so I don't know that there's like a simple answer, because definitely the best friend fleshly side of me is like, nope, that's right. To be honest, because it's really, really difficult. But is there a nuanced way? For sure. I'm sure there is. But, I feel like at the end of the day, so much is dependent on the person that has done whatever. Like if it was a moral failure, if it was a financial misappropriation, whatever the failure was, if you will own it, if you will be honest, if you will be repentant, then there is a nuanced way forward for sure. But if you're going to be in denial, or you're going to blame others, and not take responsibility for your own actions, then it makes it very difficult from a leadership perspective to give a way forward that is very positive. And I feel like certainly in Brandi's situation, that just did not happen. Like honesty did not happen. Repentance did not happen. And so that becomes, for me, really hard. And maybe for people who are better spiritually than me, they can have a better answer. But like for me, that is very difficult. But if you're broken and honest and repentant, I'll go a long way with you and help you, and will help restore you. And it may not mean you're back in ministry ever again, because maybe you shouldn't be, but we can walk with you. But if you, just like I always say, but because a lot of the outcry is, where was their accountability? Where was the accountability? Well, accountability is only as good as the honesty somebody brings to it. And if they are not honest, then there can't be accountability. There can't. I don't care how many accountability meetings you set up. If somebody's not honest, you can't hold them accountable. And so, that's part of the challenge as you are dealing with leaders kind of in general, is a lot of it is on them to own it, apologize, all the things. And then you can work on some restoration work and moving forward. But in the absence of that, I think it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I also want to acknowledge, like Laurie, I appreciate the fire in your answer. I really do. Like I would invite more from both of you, even to the point of, you need to put me in my place, because I'm the largely objective, uninvolved person asking you highly invasive questions about your life. But I do know this is what people are trying to figure out right now. this predictable pattern. It's so cliche. Can we find another way? Can we go upstream? Lori, Brandi, let me get your reaction, as much as I'm aware that I'm asking you something that was extremely personal, but I'd be curious what you think.
I actually agree wholeheartedly with Lori in regards to, when you're working with someone who is honest and repentant and is willing to do the hard work of healing, then I am all about second chances. I am all about seeing restoration. I know personally for me, I prayed face down on the floor many times for restoration of my marriage. And I got to the point where I realized that that restoration was going to happen, but God wanted to restore me. So that became my focus of this is very broken and it takes two people to fix it. And when two people are not willing to fix it, then it's not going to happen. And I am really grateful that I had the clarity to walk away when I did and not continue to give second chances that weren't deserved or earned. So yeah, no, I agree with the passion and the fiery answer that Lori gave. When somebody is willing to do that work and allow God to change them, anything is possible with Jesus. But we have to be willing to allow him to change our lives. And so many times, in positions that you're referencing and that we're talking about here, I think those people just feel untouchable and they like to function by their own rules. And they like to spin stories. People in that position are usually great storytellers and excellent manipulators. And they end up going to do ministry at other places and hired and are, paid great salaries because they're really good at spinning the truth, not because they're telling the truth and not because they've done restoration work. And when that is not followed upon in an accurate way, I just sit back and think, okay, now the problem becomes yours, because the work has not been done in order for what has happened in the past to not happen again in the future.
This leads us beautifully into kind of the second portion of this podcast. We are currently in a series where we're really noticing where the anxiety is in any group of people. And one of the things that we're paying attention to with several of our guests is who's generating the anxiety, who's carrying that anxiety, and what micro adjustments are the carriers making to keep everything stable. So I was raised in a home with a really angry dad. He was never violent. He was never abusive, but he had red hot anger. He would come home from work and dump it on us. I've always been, even though I'm a big 6'3" guy, I've always been very sensitive. He would unload and I couldn't handle it. And so my mom and my sister and I, we like, okay, I couldn't say this as a kid, but now dad generates the anxiety. We carry it. And we now read the room and make sure that the big guy is stable. That would be an example. Brandi, does that trigger anything in you as you now look back on some of those patterns?
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I carried the anxiety that was presented in my marriage. I also carried the shame that wasn't dealt with, from, his past and what he had not done the work for. So yeah, no, I think that speaks very true that it is important to recognize what we are carrying that is not ours to control. Because if it's not ours to control, then there's no way we're going to be able to fix it or change it or find peace that we're desperately searching for in that.
Anytime somebody says enough and they then disrupt the system, oftentimes the anxiety generator sabotages. They'll intensify or they'll move into victim mode or something like that. Lori, I'm not looking to put Pete and Brandi as the case here, but Lori, does that raise anything in you in a general, when you think of people, you're like, oh, I've seen that happen where somebody finally says, I'm not going to carry all the anxiety, I'm going to put it back where it belongs on the person, and then that person goes crazy?
Well, the simple answer is yes, I have seen that. I have seen that both in members of our church family, and I certainly watched that happen, and watched Brandi navigate that, and it did not end with her divorce, right? Like she, in some ways, still navigates that. She has just learned to do it really beautifully and with a lot of strength. And so that's a real good, but yeah, I think that totally resonates. And I think the hard thing for a person that's sitting in the seat that am sitting in, when it comes to, someone that you love so much, a best friend, a family member, a sister, I don't know, something. And you're watching this happen, and you're watching that kind of disruption happening in their families, watching them trying to step up into like their own strength, but also watching chaos happen in their lives. It's also you can be tempted to carry it as well, right? Even long distance. We would talk on the phone for 3 or 4 hours every single day at the height of everything kind of falling apart. And on the phone, I would try to just be like, how are we feeling? I'll feel the way you feel. Like, like I'm going to do like whatever you want to do. And I would hang up and I would go out to my husband's office and I'd put my head in his lap and I would just bawl for like 30 minutes. And I would just tell him like, here's all these things and she doesn't know. And I would just cry, trying to, I think, let me get it out just a little bit, because it also felt heavy for me. And it wasn't my family and it wasn't my children, but it was my very best friend. And so I personally was struggling on this kind of outer edge of trying to be there and kind of hold her arms up in the Moses kind of way, right? And also not try to carry what wasn't mine, right? Like there was such a delicate balance there. And I probably did not get it right most of the time, but I think you can even be on the outside edges of that and have some of those same experiences, definitely in a lesser form, not the same, but you can definitely have some of those same characteristics and feelings like you're trying to carry things as well.
Yeah. So one of the tools we help people with is to notice the 4 spaces of anxiety, where you can walk into any environment and try to figure out, where is it? And so the 4 spaces are the space inside me. What's going on in me? How do I know? And am I spreading anxiety? Am I catching it? Second space is the space between me and the other. This is really easy to notice if you've ever tried to get a child out the door on time for an event, school or that's between you and that child. Third space is the space inside the other person. Anytime you're trying to worry your way to someone else changing who they are, your brain's in their brain. Like for me, I'm a people pleaser. So oftentimes it's like, oh, what are they thinking? But then sometimes if you're frustrated, it's like, what were they thinking? But either way, you're in their brain. That's the third space. The fourth space is the space between others. It's the space that was already going on before you walked in the room. And just by walking in the room, you change the mood. Like, as a pastor, I can kill any party just by showing up to it. It's one of the few things I hate about being a pastor. It's like God's police officer has arrived on the scene. The fun is over, Or sometimes you're in the room and like Wendell walks in and just everything changes. Like he changed the room. Out of those 4 spaces, which one would you ladies be most naturally aware of? And which one would you be least aware of, do you think?
I think answering this question, where I am today, is very different than where I was 7 years ago. I think I would say I'm most in tune at this point with the space inside of me, and continuing to learn about that. And I'm probably in the phase right now where I recognize my emotions, and then I am practicing self-compassion of, it's understandable you feel that way, or it's okay that you reacted a certain way. So I think right now, when I'm functioning at my healthiest, the space inside me is where I am most comfortable and most attuned to. I know I'm leaning into unhealth when I move into that space inside the other. And I really do try to get someone to love me back by, I'm a 2 on the Enneagram, Steve. I'm a helper. And I am trying to manipulate. My primal question is, am I loved? And I am trying to sweetly manipulate to make sure that I'm going to receive love back. And then I cross into their head of what do they think about me? How do they feel? Will they show up? Are they going to abandon me? Will I get rejected? So I lean into my unhealthy when I realize it's the space in others that I am functioning in.
Yeah, what a great answer. Thank you very much. How about you, Lori?
I probably more naturally lean into the space with others. I try to carry a lot for other people that I have not been asked to carry by them. I don't need to be asked. I don't need permission. I will do it on my own. I'll just take it on. And so whether that, be a coworker or my kids or a parent or something like that, I'm very aware of what's going on. And then I do make a lot of assumptions. And my assumption is typically I need to step in. I need to step in. This is something they didn't ask me to do, or I need to step in and take care of things or whatever. And probably the one I am least is in myself. I am a classic stuffer. My dad is an engineer. Judd always tells me, babe, you are just the daughter of an engineer. This is my dad, really mad, really happy, super excited, super sad. Like he's just very chill.
He's like a donkey. You can never tell what mood a donkey is in. They always look the same.
Just like this. And so he's super sweet. But I was like, but I know what he's doing. It's because he's doing what I do. It's like you just stuff it until it becomes too much to carry, right? And so the times I realize what's going on, it's usually progressed to a point of like where it's now screaming in my face, you must acknowledge me inside of you. And usually it's Judd saying, hey, babe, I'm noticing some things and you need to spend some time filling back up. You're too empty or you're carrying too much or whatever. And so that's the one that I know is probably my weakness for myself.
This conversation has already been like quite a gauntlet. I really genuinely appreciate both of you showing up the way you did. It's such a gift to understand more about what's going on and the impact and the recovery and the hope. I'm sorry to say there's still a gauntlet to come. No guest of the Being Human podcast can escape the gauntlet of anxiety questions. 4 to 6 questions. You guys get to decide if you want to bounce ping pong style or both answer them. You guys have all the power here. Yeah, you can do 2 or 3 each if you want. That's fine. But we are going to start
2 or 3 each.
With a bang, as is the nature of the gauntlet. And so I'll ask the question and you guys can awkwardly stare at each other. Why don't we just have one of you? We'll do 4 to 6 questions and let's bounce back and forth. So, Lori, congratulations. You get the first question. What is a recurring statement that your inner critic tells you?
Oh my gosh, thank goodness I have an easy one because my inner critic is very loud. She is a screamer. For sure, it is you're not enough. It is what I have struggled with since, really, I don't feel like I always struggled with this, but when I became a pastor's wife, I had a couple of people not encouraging me to marry Judd, not because of Judd, because of me, and not feeling like my personality was right to be a pastor's wife, or I was just too much, or whatever the case may be. Had several conversations like that. And what I learned from it, what I wrote on my own heart is you're just not good enough. You got to change you got to fix you got to whatever. And it has been the journey of we have been married almost 28 years. And I still feel like it is the one thing I battle the most, is that voice in my head constantly questioning that.
Okay. Brandi, what is one way that you treat others that if you started treating yourself the same way, your life would be better?
Oh, compassion, for sure. I am very hard on myself. I even battled that disease where we, should all over ourselves. And I give a lot of compassion and grace for other people when they make mistakes or when they are having a hard time moving forward, and often don't give that to myself. I'm very, very hard on myself.
Okay. Lori, 2 dynamics that infect every relationship: assumptions and reactivity. Tell us about an assumption that you've held about someone that was wildly off.
Oh gosh, this probably happens all the time. I don't know that I always find out the true answer. I have a very creative imagination. And so I can write an entire storyline about why somebody couldn't you know, go to dinner, why they didn't answer the phone or whatever. I can create a whole narrative in my brain and make a lot of assumptions. And I've had to learn to like stop myself and rewrite them. So sometimes I rewrite beautiful stories about how I got cut off on the freeway because that guy's wife is in labor in his car and now he's got to get. So I may never hear the flip side truth of the assumption. But as long as I'm trying, like working really hard, it's going to go to all the effort to assume something. It's gonna be for the best. Um, so I don't necessarily worry about what the truth is on the back end, as long as I can stop myself from just assuming the most negative thing I can and trying to write a more positive story until I know otherwise. I think like one example would be we have this really sweet gal who used to be on our staff, and she reached out to me and said, "Can I talk to you next week?" And then everything in me was like, I had a whole week to imagine what she was going to say to me, and I wrote this whole huge narrative out, and about how she was leaving and she hated us and all the whole thing. And then I was like, stop. I rewrote it to like, she just wants to tell me how much she loves us and we're friends and all this stuff. So I was like, I just need to believe this for the next 5 days. So I rewrote this. And when I got on the phone, it was somewhere in between. It was, I love you guys so much and I'm leaving. but I needed both of those kind of moments to work on those assumptions and then just go into it with a little bit more open-handed attitude.
Fantastic. What a great example. Brandi, anytime any of us are the only one of our kind in a room, it's harder to be ourselves. Now, I'm a white guy. I'm at the center of power. The world is tilted toward me, especially the church world. But sometimes my teenage daughter brings a bunch of Swifties home for lunch, and it's me and a bunch of high school girls, and it's terrifying, right? You then see if, like, you're an African-American woman and you walk into a room and it's all white guys, you are working 10 times harder to be yourself. So with that context, here's our question. Tell us about a time you were the only one of your kind in a room. What was it like for you?
Oh gosh, good question. Yeah, I would say I probably have felt this the most as a single mom. And I have 3 sons who I'm extremely close to and they've always lived the majority of their time with me. And they all play football. So I have ended up over the years at so many practices, college visits, 7-on-7s, and lots of times when it's not like the big Friday night game and only one parent shows up, it's the dad. And for my family, it's me. So I think I have shown up in a lot of spaces where I love football and love cheering on my kids, but definitely feel like I'm out of place because I'm not, the typical parent that shows up for those things. I think I have responded to it because I know that my kids actually want me there, that I'm not showing up for anyone else but the kid who's on the field. And that is the value and the relationship that we have, that they expect mom. One of our family values is that we show up, and they expect mom to show up. So, yep, the single mom thing has probably been the most recently that I have felt like the odd person in the room or on the sideline, but definitely worth every awkwardness to be there cheering on my kid.
Okay, very good. We're on the home stretch. You guys are sailing through the gauntlet. I'm always uncomfortable as the host when my guests sail through. I'm always trying to, really cause pain
us?
here. So,
Yes.
But we're on the home stretch. Lori, when the local church is at its best, what does it offer that you can't get anywhere else?
Oh, yeah. I just hope. I just feel like hope. I feel like when people show up at our church on a weekend, it might be the 1 hour of hope they have in a week where they're, being prayed over, where they are being told that God is with them, that they're not alone, that like it is the anchoring peace, of hope in their lives. And I think it's just, Jesus and his bride coming together to offer it to people. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. I think it's what changes lives. And I think if we could, as church leaders, can focus on giving that kind of hope to people, then you could just what a difference it makes in lives and families and marriages and, the fight for sobriety, all of it. So that's why I would say hope. Hope is what I think we're in the hope dispensing business in the church.
Amazing. Okay, Brandi, you get the final word. When in your life lately have you felt most fully and completely loved?
Oh, I had a milestone birthday. I'm not going to tell you how old I am. I had a milestone birthday, and I felt super loved by friends and family. My kids went over and above this year for the first time. They all sent me individual videos they had recorded on their own, talking about our relationship and what they appreciated about me. So yeah, I felt super loved on that big milestone birthday. Made it a little bit easier.
My guests have been Brandi Wilson and Youre Wilhite. They have given us such a gift today of just opening up their lives, giving us their perspectives on obviously what is Brandi's story, but even as you hear from Youre, what it's like to be a ride or die friend that we all are in desperate need of today. Brandi and Youre are the founders of Leading and Loving It, an incredible ministry of leadership, particularly for women, but anyone gets to benefit from it. They're the authors of the book, the co-authors of the book, Leading and Loving It. Brandi's most recent book, Better Than Okay, Finding Hope and Healing After Your Marriage Ends. Youre has a wonderful series called Chasing Happy, a study of Philippians. We're going to have all the links to that in the show notes. Brandi and Youre, thanks so much for coming on Being Human.
Oh, Steve,
Thanks for having us.
You.